The morning sun had just started to rise over a quiet private airport near Monaco. The sky was soft with colors of orange and gold, and the air was still. A sleek black jet sat on the runway, ready for takeoff. Inside, the crew moved quickly, checking everything before the VIP guest arrived. Miriam, one of the flight attendants, had worked on private jets for years. She was sharp, confident, and always paid attention to details. Today, she had heard there would be an important passenger, but no one told her exactly who it was. She expected someone flashy, maybe wearing expensive jewelry or surrounded by assistants. When a black woman walked up the steps to the plane alone, wearing a simple gray sweater, jeans, and sneakers, Miriam raised an eyebrow. The woman had no big suitcase, no loud greeting, no sign of being anyone special. She just smiled politely and said, "Good morning," in a calm voice. Miriam didn't smile back. Instead, she gave a short nod and pointed toward one of the empty seats. The woman who introduced herself as Renee thanked her quietly and sat down near the window. She looked out at the sky, peaceful and relaxed, while Miriam walked away without saying another word. Inside the cabin, everything was spotless: cream leather seats, gold finishes, and wide windows. It was the kind of jet only a billionaire could afford. Miriam thought Rennie was just a guest, maybe a friend of the real owner. She didn't bother to offer help or even water unless asked. Rennie sat quietly, looking at her phone. After a few minutes, she asked politely, "Could I get a bottle of water, please?" Miriam sighed but went to get it. She returned and handed it to Rennie without a smile. "Anything else?" she asked with a flat tone. "No, thank you," Rennie replied, still calm. Miriam turned and walked away, thinking the woman was being too comfortable for someone who didn't belong. Other crew members noticed her attitude, but didn't say anything. They had seen Miriam act this way before, always judging people by how they looked. As the engines started to roar and the jet began moving down the runway, Renee closed her eyes. She wasn't angry. She had seen this kind of treatment before. But what Miriam didn't know was that Renee wasn't just another passenger. She wasn't someone who had borrowed a seat on someone else's plane. She owned it. But Rennie wasn't the kind to show off. She believed that how a person treated others, especially when they didn't know who they were, said everything about them. And today, Miriam was about to learn that lesson in a way she would never forget. As the jet leveled out above the clouds, Rennie looked around the cabin. It was quiet and clean, but there was a certain coldness in the air. The way the crew moved, the way Miriam glanced at her now and then, it was clear she wasn't being treated like someone important. Rennie noticed everything, but she stayed calm. She had dealt with people like Miriam before. People who thought they knew who mattered and who didn't, just by looking at someone's clothes or skin or the way they spoke. Rennie had grown used to being underestimated. Miriam moved around the cabin, checking on the other passengers. She smiled at them, brought them drinks, and even asked if they needed anything extra. But when she walked past Renee, her smile disappeared. She didn't stop. She didn't ask if Renee was comfortable. After a while, Renee politely asked, "Do you have a charger for this seat? My phone is running low." Miriam sighed, clearly annoyed. "This is a private jet," she said sharply. "We don't carry chargers for every type of phone. You should have brought your own." Renee gave a small nod. "Thank you anyway," she said softly. Another crew member, a younger man named Leo, overheard the exchange. He walked over quietly a few minutes later and handed Rennie a charger with a kind smile. "This should work," he said. Rennie thanked him, and he returned to his duties. Miriam noticed but didn't say anything. As the hours passed, Rennie asked for a blanket. Miriam brought one, but she tossed it onto the seat beside Rennie without a word. It slipped off the cushion and landed on the floor. Rennie picked it up herself. She didn't complain. She didn't raise her voice. Another passenger across the aisle gave Rennie a curious look. He had seen how she was treated and wondered who she was. She didn't look upset. In fact, she looked calm, almost like she was waiting for something. The jet was halfway through its journey when Rennie stood up to stretch her legs. She walked slowly toward the back, looking at the design of the plane, touching the polished wood along the wall. Miriam rushed over, standing in her way. "You can't just walk around like that," Miriam snapped. "This isn't a tour." Rennie looked at her calmly and said, I think I know this plane well enough. Miriam gave a short laugh. Oh, do you now? She said, folding her arms. You think you own the place? Rennie didn't answer. She simply smiled and walked back to her seat. The other passengers watched in silence. They didn't know who Rennie was, but something about the way she carried herself made them curious. It was clear she wasn't just anyone. And soon, everyone, including Miriam, would find out just how wrong first impressions could be. The jet continued to fly smoothly through the clear blue sky, but the mood inside the cabin was growing more tense. Rennie stayed seated, looking out the window, her face calm but thoughtful. The way Miriam had spoken to her was not just rude, it was personal. But still, Rennie didn't react. She had learned long ago that silence often spoke louder than words. Miriam walked by again, pretending to check the overhead compartments. Her eyes quickly glanced at Rennie, who was now writing something in a notebook. Miriam frowned, then turned away, annoyed that Rennie wasn't reacting or asking for help like others usually did. She didn't like being ignored, especially by someone she had already decided wasn't important. The other passengers were starting to feel the change in energy too. Some of them whispered quietly. They had noticed how Miriam acted differently around Rennie. A woman across the aisle leaned toward her husband and said softly, Why is she treating that woman like that? She's been polite the whole time. The husband shrugged. Maybe Miriam thinks she's just a guest, he said. She's wrong. That woman carries herself like someone important. At one point, Rennie pressed the call button above her seat. When Miriam arrived, she didn't hide her irritation. Yes, she asked, arms crossed. Could I please move to that open seat by the front? Rennie asked kindly. It looks a bit quieter. Miriam rolled her eyes. Those seats are usually for VIP guests, she said sharply. I'll have to check. That's fine, Rennie said. Take your time. Miriam walked off in a huff, clearly not planning to check at all. Rennie simply sat back and continued to write in her notebook. She was patient. She had a reason for everything she did. Leo, the younger flight attendant, walked past a moment later and noticed Rennie hadn't been moved. Would you like me to check that front seat for you? He asked. No, thank you, Rennie said gently. It's okay. Miriam noticed Leo speaking with Rennie again and gave him a sharp look. He returned to his duties without saying a word, but the tension was now obvious to more than just Rennie. The jet had a few hours left before landing, but for many on board, time felt slow. Everyone could sense that something wasn't right, though no one knew the full story yet. Rennie leaned her head back, closed her eyes, and took a deep breath. She had been quiet long enough. Soon she would speak, not with anger, but with truth. Because when someone shows you who they are, it's only fair that you show them who you are too. As the plane continued to fly smoothly above the clouds, the quiet tension between Rennie and Miriam finally reached its peak. The mood inside the cabin had changed. Some passengers kept stealing glances, waiting to see what might happen next. Others simply stayed silent, unsure of what to say. Rennie stood up again, this time slowly stretching her arms. She walked carefully toward the back of the cabin, taking in the details of the plane. She touched the side panel gently, her fingers tracing the fine grain of the wood. She wasn't doing anything wrong, just moving calmly and peacefully. But Miriam saw her and immediately rushed over. What are you doing? Miriam said, stepping in front of her. You can't just wander around the plane. Rennie looked at her with a steady gaze. Her voice was calm and clear. I'm just walking. I know the layout well. Miriam scoffed. Of course you do, she said, arms crossed. You think just because you're sitting on a private jet, you can act like you own it? Rennie didn't answer right away. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, watching Miriam with quiet patience. Then she said, actually, yes, I can. Miriam laughed. Sure, and I'm the Queen of England, she said sarcastically. Then, in a sudden burst of frustration, she reached out and slapped Remy's arm lightly, not to hurt, but in a way that clearly showed disrespect. Don't play games with me. Sit down. The cabin fell silent. The sound wasn't loud, but the action was. It was enough to make every head turn. Leo, the young flight attendant, dropped the tray he was carrying. Another passenger gasped. Someone else stood up halfway from their seat. For a moment, time felt frozen. Rennie didn't move. She didn't flinch. She simply looked down at where Miriam had touched her, then back up at her face. Just then, a voice came from behind. "Miss Rennie, is everything all right?" It was the pilot, standing just a few feet away. His face showed deep concern. Beside him was the co-pilot, also watching closely. Both men looked serious and respectful. Miriam blinked in confusion. "Miss Rennie?" she repeated softly. The pilot nodded. "Please let us know if you need anything. We can speak privately when you're ready." Rennie smiled politely and nodded. "Thank you. I'll let you know." Miriam stepped back, her face pale. Something inside her shifted. For the first time, she wasn't sure what was happening. Rennie turned to walk back to her seat, quiet and calm as ever. But everything had changed. The other passengers stared, whispers spreading fast through the cabin. Miriam stood frozen, slowly realizing that she might have made a mistake, one far bigger than she could have imagined. Miriam stood frozen, watching Rennie return to her seat with quiet strength. The other passengers stared as well, still shocked by what had just happened. A flight attendant had touched a passenger in anger, and now the pilot was calling that same passenger Ms. Rennie with clear respect. Something didn't add up. Miriam's mind was racing. She had assumed Rennie was just another passenger, someone riding along with someone important. But now, doubt crept in. She remembered Rennie's calm words. "I think I know this plane well." It hadn't been a joke. Maybe Rennie had meant exactly what she said. The pilot walked back toward the front, but before he disappeared, he looked at Miriam and gave her a long, serious stare. He didn't say a word, but his face said everything. Miriam felt her hands grow cold. She turned to Leo, hoping for some kind of explanation. "Who is she?" she whispered. Leo didn't answer right away. He leaned in closer and spoke in a low voice so no one else could hear. "You really don't know?" he asked. Miriam shook her head. Leo glanced around then said, "That's Rennie Kingsley. She bought the entire jet company last month. She's the new owner." Miriam's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She stared at Rennie, who now sat quietly, reading something on her tablet as if nothing had happened. "Are you sure?" Miriam asked, her voice almost trembling. Leo nodded. "Everyone in the company got an email about it. She's a billionaire. Started from nothing and now owns part of the airline, the jet service, and even the company that trains us." Miriam stepped back, her heart sinking. She had insulted her boss. She had slapped the arm of the woman who signed her paycheck. Meanwhile, Rennie continued reading. She didn't need to raise her voice. She didn't need to prove anything. Her calmness was louder than anger. The co-pilot came to her quietly and asked, "Would you like us to prepare for an early landing, Miss Kingsley?" Rennie shook her head. "No need. Let's finish the flight. I'll take care of everything once we land." The co-pilot nodded and walked away. Miriam didn't know what to do. She stood near the back of the plane, unsure if she should apologize or say nothing. Every move felt wrong now. Passengers avoided her eyes. Even the other crew members gave her space. Rennie looked up and caught Miriam's eye just once. There was no anger in her face, just a calm strength that made Miriam feel even smaller. It was clear now. The woman Miriam thought was a nobody was, in fact, the most powerful person on the plane. And Miriam had just made the worst mistake of her career. The jet flew steadily, but inside the cabin, no one could relax. The air was heavy with silence. Passengers whispered in low voices, glancing now and then at Rennie, who sat calmly in her seat, focused on her tablet. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't made a scene, but everyone knew something serious had just happened. Miriam stayed at the back of the plane. Her hands were shaking slightly, though she tried to hide it. She felt her face growing warm with regret. She had been rude. She had judged Rennie unfairly. And now she knew the truth. Rennie wasn't just another guest. She was the owner. The same woman she had treated with disrespect owned the very jet Miriam worked on. Not only that, she owned part of the company itself. Leo came up to her quietly. "You should apologize," he said gently. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't even get angry. That's a level of grace most people don't have. Miriam nodded slowly but didn't move. She didn't know what to say. Would an apology even help now? As the plane started its descent, the pilot made an announcement. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be landing shortly. Please fasten your seatbelts and remain seated until we come to a full stop. We thank you for flying with us today. Miriam looked toward Renee, who quietly placed her tablet in her bag and sat upright. Her face showed no emotion, just calm control. When the wheels touched the runway, the jet rolled smoothly along the private tarmac. Outside the window, luxury cars were already waiting. A black SUV stood out, clearly prepared for someone important. Once the jet came to a stop, the cabin door opened. A man in a suit entered, walking directly to Renee. "Miss Kingsley," he said with a respectful nod, "your car is ready, and the team is prepared for the meeting as scheduled." Renee smiled and stood. "Thank you," she said. She walked down the aisle slowly, her steps steady. The passengers made room without a word. Some nodded, others just watched with quiet respect. When she reached the exit, she paused and turned slightly toward Miriam, who stood nervously near the galley. There was a long pause. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath. Renee looked at Miriam and said calmly, "Thank you for your service today." Her words were polite, but her tone carried a message deeper than anything else she could have said. She didn't mention the slap. She didn't bring up the insults. She didn't need to. Miriam swallowed hard and lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry, Miss Kingsley," she said softly. Renee nodded once and walked off the plane. The door closed behind her, but the weight of her presence stayed behind. The crew and passengers knew they had witnessed something important, not just about power, but about character. And Miriam would never forget it. After Renee stepped off the plane, the silence inside the cabin remained. No one moved for a moment. Everyone was still thinking about what had just happened. It wasn't every day that a billionaire flew without a loud welcome, without special treatment, and without even revealing who she was. Leo helped the passengers with their bags, his face calm but thoughtful. He had seen something powerful that day, not power in money, but power in how a person carries themselves when others treat them unfairly. Miriam stayed quiet as she helped gather items from the galley. Her hands moved slowly, her thoughts racing. She had worked on private jets for years. She had served famous people, wealthy people, and important leaders. But never had she made such a big mistake. As she cleaned up the aisle, another passenger walked past her and stopped. "You didn't know who she was, did you?" the woman asked kindly. Miriam shook her head. "No, I judged her too quickly." The woman nodded. "We all saw it. The way she handled herself. That was true class." Miriam didn't reply. She just looked down at the floor, feeling the weight of her choices. By the time the last passenger left the plane, the crew was quiet. The usual light chatter was gone. Leo turned to Miriam and spoke carefully. "She didn't fire you. She didn't even raise her voice." Miriam looked at him. "She could have, and I wouldn't have blamed her." Leo nodded. "But she didn't. That's what makes it worse in a way. It shows she's the kind of person we should have respected from the start." Outside, Renee stepped into her SUV. The driver opened the door for her without a word. Once inside, she pulled out her phone and opened her email. A draft was already waiting, notes about the flight, the behavior of the crew, and how the company might improve its training. She didn't name anyone directly in the report, but her message was clear. Respect should never depend on appearance. Her driver glanced in the mirror. "Everything all right, Miss Kingsley?" She looked out the window at the clear sky. "Yes," she said. "Just another lesson for all of us." Back at the private terminal, Miriam sat alone in the crew lounge, her head resting in her hands. She knew her name might be in a report, but more than that, she knew she had lost something harder to fix, someone's trust. It was a moment she would replay in her mind again and again, not because of punishment, but because of what she had failed to see. And from that day on, she promised herself one thing: never judge anyone by what they wear, how they look, or where they sit. Because the quietest person on the plane might be the one who owns it. Days had passed since the flight, but the memory of it stayed fresh in Miriam's mind. She sat at her small desk, reading an email from the company's head office. It was sent to all flight crew. The subject line was simple: respect starts with how we treat people. The message didn't mention names. It didn't list what happened, but the meaning was clear. It talked about a recent flight where a crew member had misjudged someone important. The email reminded everyone that every person on board deserves equal kindness, no matter who they are. Miriam read the email twice. She knew it was about her, and even though her name wasn't there, the truth was loud in her heart. Meanwhile, Renee was sitting in a quiet meeting room, listening to her staff. They were going over ideas to improve customer service on the jets. One person suggested new uniforms, another suggested more luxury features. Renee listened carefully, then raised her hand. "Those are good ideas," she said, "but let's not forget the most important one, training people to treat every guest with dignity from the moment they step on board." The room nodded in agreement. Renee continued, "We won't grow as a company by just upgrading seats. We grow by upgrading how we treat each other." That afternoon, she walked through the company's main office. Many employees greeted her with smiles and polite words. A few looked nervous, unsure how to act around her now that they knew who she really was. But Renee treated everyone the same. She asked questions, thanked people for their work, and listened to ideas. Later that week, Renee received a letter. It was handwritten and sent from Miriam. In the letter, Miriam apologized again, not for the sake of her job, but because she truly understood the mistakes she made. She wrote about how she had judged without knowing, how she had learned a hard but important lesson, and how she would never treat another guest that way again. Renee read the letter quietly. She placed it in her folder, along with other documents, and said to herself, "Growth starts with honesty." Miriam continued working, but something in her had changed. She no longer assumed anything about the people she served. She greeted each guest with care and respect, whether they wore a suit or simple clothes. She paid attention, she listened more, and she never forgot that moment on the plane. One quiet morning, as she prepared for a new flight, Leo walked by and said, "You good?" Miriam smiled softly. "Better," she said, "and wiser." Outside, another jet waited on the runway, ready for takeoff. But the real journey had already happened, inside hearts, inside minds, and in the choices people made when no one was watching. And that, in the end, was the flight that truly mattered.